started recording. That's great. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. And you already, most of you will already have met him as the outgoing chair of the botany section. He's been a very long-standing member of the London Natural History Society, and he's probably somebody who needs very little introduction to most of you. He's chaired the Botany Committee for many, many years. He's also our Conservation Officer. So it's sad to see him stepping down from the chair, but we all understand why he's made the decision to do that. But we're really glad that he's still going to be involved in many ways. Now, apparently, I didn't realise this, but I just found out recently that he didn't actually fully realise his passion for plants until he was 40 years old. So he's not somebody who's necessarily been, you know, kind of developing his expertise from early on. So I'm very impressed with the progress he's made since then. He soon made up for lost time, and he began devoting his life to studying botany, to caring for local green spaces, and inspiring a love for nature in others. And again, I think that's something that he's really brought to his role as chair. He's a retired natural history teacher, and he's also, very importantly, the former conservation officer for the London Borough of Haringey. David played a vital part in the conservation of some of North London's best known wild places, and he can be credited for helping to revive several ancient traditions, particularly woodland coppicing. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about this in his talk. And he also, another thing just to let people know, he also was the person who initiated the tradition of the Haringey fungus foray, a great tradition there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to hand you over to David for what I'm sure is going to be a really fascinating talk. So David, it's over to you.
Right, so what do? I've got another picture of you.
You're going to find your share screen, little square again, yeah, and maybe double click it if necessary.
Yeah, nothing happens. Share.
That's it. It's coming. Sometimes it's just a little bit slow. Yep, here we are. That's fine. We can see your picture fine.
I think we're all right.
We are. Yeah.
Thank you kindly. Yes, I'm going to talk about some fragments of ancient woodland that have become very important to me over the years. Ancient woodland in itself is a wonderful habitat. I don't think there's any other habitat that connects us in the same way to the distant past. And these woods are full of history, and they have become an important part of my life, really. It's probably worthwhile saying a little bit about how woodland became important to me. It is perfectly true that I came to studying botany comparatively late in life. I think I was quite 40 when I got there, but I very rapidly became interested in woodland. And at the time, we're going back about 40 years, in about 1980, I was running a course on natural history with the rather ambitious title of The Natural History of Southeast England. And I was nervous as anything. So I thought, well, the only way I'm going to survive this is to take them out into the field and show them things that I know a little bit about. And that was what I did. And the first picture that you're looking at there is a slide of a wonderful wood called Mad Bess. That's one of the Rystic Woods. And it was very close to Uxbridge, where this course was happening. And it made a very suitable field meeting venue. So I sort of began to learn my trade with regard to woodland in the region, I suppose, about 40 years ago. And I was fortunate in choosing a place which was particularly relevant to today's talk. It's a wood that has become very well known in West London. The Rystic Woods are the largest block of woodlands in Greater London, and they support a remarkable range of wildlife, which I became involved with. The woods themselves cover, I think, about 329 hectares. That's a lot of woodland. And the woods I'm going to be talking about tonight are very much smaller. But the reason I'm mentioning this right at the start of the walk is that this is the largest chunk of oak hornbeam woodland, and we'll talk about that in a moment, that still exists in southeast England. And so by getting to know the Rystic Woods a little bit, this was a grand opening for me when I started to look at my own little local woods. So we're now going to move, and I hope it'll do what it's meant to do. We shall see. Yes, it has done what it's meant to do. Good. Here is a map. You shall all see a map now of the boundary between Barnet and Haringey. Haringey on the right, Barnet to the left. And the green bits are the fragments of woodland that I want to talk to you all about tonight. From the place where I live, which is just up to the east of Bluebell Wood there, all these woods are within 7 hectares of my house. That for me was wonderful because I didn't have to travel very far to visit splendid woodlands. So the way I'm trying to organize this talk is that we're going to look at each of the woods in turn initially. We're then going to have a look particularly at the trees that they support. And that will lead us on to management, and indeed coppicing is one of the things we'll be talking about. And we'll finish off with the flora, which of course is my great love. So I'll just fill those gaps in for a moment. Bluebell Wood, top right-hand corner, is my own local wood. It's within a kilometre of where I live. Coldfall Wood is the wood where I was first involved with coppicing. We'll discover that in a moment, together with Queenswood lying a little bit down below, and Highgate Wood. These are all woods that have a history of coppice work. Cherry Tree Wood is in a way an odd man out because I was due to do a survey of Cherry Tree Wood this last season, of course was not able to because of COVID. So rather a scant description of Cherry Tree Wood, but it's a valuable wood, and I'm hoping to repeat that survey or do that survey, I should say, this coming year. Into Barnet, we've got Big Wood, which inevitably is a very tiny wood. We'll talk about that in due course. Turner's Wood, which is very special, surrounded by housing. You can't get into it unless you know somebody who lives in one of the houses around the wood. And finally, down in the south here, a little fragment of Kenwood known as Northwood, which once upon a time used to be in Haringey, but the boundary commissioners in their wisdom in 1995 decided they didn't want Haringey to have it. It was going to go down to Camden. That wasn't the entire reason, but we lost that little bit of ancient woodland, which was a great shame because it's a lovely wood. But again, something of an odd man out because the geology is different and the flora is different. All the woods I've been talking about so far have a very similar background and can be accurately compared with the Rystic Woods in terms of their vegetation. So we'll take those in turn. We start off with Coldfall Wood, which was the wood that I became most closely associated with when I was studying woodland. I did a course at Birkbeck. In those days, you could do a certificate and a diploma at Birkbeck in ecology and conservation, and I did that course, and it was taught by Richard Clark, wonderful teacher. And I owe him an enormous debt because he really inspired me to get involved with woodland. And this signboard is important to me because it was made by the school that lives just across the road, a secondary school. And it emphasizes the name of the wood. Names are important. Names tell you things about woods. Coldfall Wood is called because it was at one time associated with the extraction of coal, and also not coal itself, but what you use coal for. And also the word fall was used to describe a wood where periodically a fall would be taken. In other words, it was a part of a wood that had been coppiced. We'll say a lot more about that in a moment, but I like the photograph, and for once in a blue moon it snowed, so it fitted quite nicely with the picture. We will continue. In the springtime, the early springtime, late winter, the edge of coldfall, and this is true of some of the other woods I've mentioned, and certainly true of the Rystic Woods. You have these wood structures. You have a bank with a ditch on its outside. And the function of that ditch and bank was to keep the stock that would be grazing outside the wood. This is inside the wood, this is outside the wood. The ditch and the bank on its inside prevented the stock from getting into and grazing on the regrowing coppice within the wood itself. So they were important structures, and many ancient woods display these ditch banks very clearly, and you can certainly see those in the Rystic Woods as well. Worth making the point, I think, here very quickly, two things. One, I must define what I mean by an ancient wood, and secondly, the feature which is demonstrated here is that the plants, the trees, have actually escaped. They've got across the ditch and they've got to the land opposite. And an oak tree here and several hornbeams beyond have rooted outside the wood. So these few trees would be said to be in secondary woodland, whereas the woodland within that had been coppiced and went historically far back in time as a managed woodland was distinctive. So you have secondary and you have modern woodland in that fashion. The trees, incidentally, in the picture growing on the bank, these are stubbed hornbeams. Stubbing was used to create a very dense hedge which prevented the stock who were grazing on what was then Finchley Common. This area here was part of Finchley Common, would prevent them from wandering into the wood and grazing on the regrowing coppice. So those are all hornbeams, and we'll say a bit about hornbeams in a moment. And this is an English oak, and we will talk about English oaks as well in a moment. So that's a little introductory to coldfall wood. Relevant particularly to me because I was studying for this diploma, and I chose as my subject, you had to write a dissertation at the end of your diploma, I chose as my subject to compare coldfall wood with a similar wood about 1 kilometre further north called Queenswood. And that was a recent modern woodland. And therefore, comparing the two gave me some interesting background information. And I eventually managed to get my diploma. That's by way of an introduction to coldfall. Highgate wood is probably the best known of these fragments of ancient woodland that I've mentioned so far. It's managed by the Corporation of London currently. It used to be part of the Bishop of London's hunting ground. It was then taken over by the church. The ecclesiastical commissioners looked after it for many years, and they eventually gave it to the Corporation of London at the end of the 19th century, and they have owned it ever since. Couple of points to make here. First of all, the oaks are splendidly obvious here, and we will talk about these oaks. Most of these are English oaks, but there are also sessile oaks and a few hybrids, and I will mention that in a moment, so don't worry if these are new terms. The other point, which is easy to demonstrate, but a problem for the wood, very heavily trampled. And although the paths are splendidly kept and it's good for people with children and dogs to walk up and down, it's not so good when they wander off the paths and trample densely the vegetation, which causes all sorts of problems. So Highgate has all sorts of historical connections, some of which we will spend time talking about in due course, but it's a wood that has many historical reminders. We move on to Queenswood. By this time, we're now getting into the end of the 80s. I became conservation officer for Haringey in 1989. And one of my tasks, one of the jobs I had to do was to look after a number of sites that were of conservation importance. And Queenswood was one of the most important. And one of the very first things that I did was to declare Queenswood a local nature reserve. Local authorities were authorised, and still are, they don't often do it these days, but they are authorised to choose areas within their site and declare them nature reserves, and they should then be managed to the advantage of those nature reserves. So Queenswood, and the picture tries to indicate the quite steep nature of the wood. It's on quite a steep slope on either side, which is one of the reasons it still survives. It wasn't so easy to build on, although they tried for a long time in the 19th century to build on it, but it was rescued by local people because they believed that it was valuable and important, and it survived as a reason. The painter is painting the wood. So Queenswood we're going to be talking about a lot. From my personal point of view, and indeed from the point of view of today's talk, it's important too because I carried out a detailed botanical survey of the wood at that time, and that formed a very useful backdrop, a sort of template later when I started coppicing in this wood, and we'll talk about this later. To have a backdrop of a detailed botanical survey was very helpful when I started doing the survey work of the coppices. I mentioned the historical value of ancient woods, and that is nicely demonstrated with a couple of photographs that I have of two very rare plants, or very rare in the context of London. Hard fern has almost disappeared from the London area. It does turn up in one or two places. It's a fern I know very well because I have a share of a cottage in Sussex where it's abundant. So I know hard fern very well. And I recorded this back in the early, well, part of the survey that I've just mentioned, in fact. But very sadly, it has, in recent years, it's disappeared. And I'm hoping we may get it back, but it's one plant which has gone. And it's accompanied by a similar part, which I'm now going to have to. What happens to me is I lose touch with what I'm talking about sometimes. This is still within Queenswood, and so what we're doing is we're looking at a plant. Which is a wood rush. It's the great wood rush. Suddenly hopped into my head. Awful thing happens as you get older. Your words just vanish. A wood rush. And the wood rush is another even rarer plant than the hard fern. And in 2012, this colony, which I'd known for many years, vanished just overnight. I saw it one month. I went back the following month. It hadn't gone. There were two sites for it in the wood, and it had gone from both of them. I'm pleased to tell you that it is still hanging on at Ken Wood, so it's not completely gone. But the plants tell us a lot about the history. And the point about that plant, the wood rush, was that the one in Highgate, near Highgate, was the very first British record to be made about the wood. So it's particularly sad that it disappeared. Bluebell wood, as a contrast to the other rather large woods, is very tiny, but it happens to be my local wood, and so it allowed me to mention bluebells, which are important woodland plants. And there's always been the controversy about woodlands in London, particularly. That they're having difficulties. This is the native bluebell hanging nicely to one side with a very thin corolla. The worry is that it might get together with the Spanish bluebell and form hybrids. This is a hybrid between the Spanish bluebell and the native bluebell. And the concern is that the Spanish bluebells are introgressing. They're pushing out the native bluebells. Not true, I'm pleased to be able to tell you. Quite a lot of recent research up in Scotland, as it happens, has been done on bluebells, and there is no evidence that is actually happening, despite the fact that we have hybrid bluebells around the edges of these woods, and we have little redoubts of the native as well. They both seem to manage to cope together quite happily. Big wood, I showed you briefly on the map. I've got to know very recently because it has a very active friends group, very useful and very helpful friends group, and I've taken them around on a number of occasions. This is a very instructive board. Again, it was part of the Bishop of London's Great Wood, and it has a huge history. Interesting to me and to this talk, because we know that it was clear felled in the early part of the 19th century, 1820 in fact. And so its flora is a little bit different. All the other woods that I'm telling you about and have told you about, they've all been coppiced in the distant past. We will talk about coppicing, I promise, shortly. But big wood was not coppiced in the period after 1820. That has had an interesting effect. If we move on, this is a photograph of a hazel, and the wood, big wood, is dominated by hazel now, which is very nice. I like hazel. Lots of caterpillars like eating hazel. Squirrels like eating hazel nuts. It's a productive and positive part of woodland. But in most woods, and certainly in Queenswood and in Coldfall Wood, because the woods have become very dense and dark, and we'll talk about that shortly, because the old coppices have grown tall and prevented the light from penetrating, the hazel, which is quite light demanding, has had a problem. But in big wood, it is hazel, which is the dominant tree in the understory of the wood. Favorite wood now of mine, because it is so difficult to get into, but it's wonderful when you do. This is Turner's Wood. And Turner's Wood is a little fragment of woodland I showed you on the map down towards Hampstead Heath. And it is entirely surrounded by housing, rather grand housing. And the owners of the houses have the great delight of being able to use the wood as a sort of backdrop to their gardens. So it means that if you're an outsider, it's not an easy place to get into. I was very lucky. One of the classes I was running back in the 90s, one of the attendees at the class said, "Oh, I can get you into Turner's Wood. I know one of the owners of one of the houses." So that was fantastic. So I leapt at the chance. What we're looking at there is the bottom of the person's garden that backs onto Turner's Wood itself, and the trees in the distance, those are largely sessile oaks. Turner's Wood is largely occupied by sessile oak. That is rather strange, because most of the woods that I've been talking about, the dominant tree is the English oak. And if you were at the first talk about Hampstead Heath, I was writing about his name, Jeff Duckett, was telling us a little bit about the trees and the difference between the sessile and the English. And I'm not going to bore you with that now. But the reality is that in the early or the late 19th century, early 20th century, the dominant tree, apparently, according to Salisbury, and you have to read all the literature to find this out, the dominant tree was the sessile oak. Today, the sessile oak is comparatively rare. You find it in Kenwood, it's here in Turner's Wood, and it's interestingly enough, it's in Bluebell Wood. It's the dominant wood there, the sessile oak. And the suggestion is that there's been a change in the preference of woodland types by people who need wood for building, that this may explain it. I can see why the people who lived in the houses around the edge of Turner's Wood were so pleased to have access to it. It is the most beautiful wood, and it has a stream that runs through the middle. That photograph was taken in June, just after the bluebells had finished. In the foreground here, you can see a few bluebells, and they're rapidly disappearing. But it has this stream through the middle. And what was very interesting to me, again, in terms of the issue around the wildlife of these woods, the flora of these woods, growing all along the edge of the stream was a fern called the soft shield fern. And around the turn of the century, about 2002, two colleagues of mine from the London Natural History Society had visited the wood. And one of them, John Edgington, in fact, great expert on ferns, certainly would have seen the soft shield fern when he surveyed the wood. No mention of it. So the soft shield fern had come in between 2002 and 2000. I think it was about 2010 that I found it in that period, which was rather interesting. And that is another clue towards the way in which the vegetation is changing. The soft shield ferns are quite often grown as ornamental ferns in gardens, and my theory is that they're probably escaped from gardens. And if I haven't have time towards the end of the talk, we'll talk about exotic plants that have escaped from elsewhere. But one plant which is certainly not exotic, but is really nice to be able to show you, once upon a time used to grow in Turner's Wood. And the botanist known as Irvine surveyed the wood at the beginning of the 19th century. And he recorded this lovely plant. This is the large bittercress. And large bittercress in those days was a part of the flora, which was lovely to know. It's sadly very long gone. That was actually photographed down in Dorset, down in Sussex, where I spend a lot of time. But in nearly 200 years' time ago, it was in Turner's Wood as well. The last fragment of woodland I want to show you, I know that there's only been 7, but I haven't showed you pictures of cherry tree wood, and I haven't showed you pictures of Northwood, part of Kenwood, but I am going to show you this picture. This is Oak Hill Wood. That was the last fragment of ancient woodland that I kind of became aware of recently. And I'm very glad I did. It's a very splendid wood. What we're looking at there is 2 different trees. That's English oak, and that one I think is a hornbeam, and that's certainly a hornbeam there, being widely enjoyed. Again, you can see the slope going down. Most of these woods are found on slopes, which at some point must have been a challenge for the house builders. And there's a stream at the bottom of this wood. The other thing, again, if I have time, which I'm desperately worried about, because I'm going a lot still to cover, this is the Norway Maple, an exotic tree. I'm going to say quite a bit about exotics, and not in a fierce manner, in a rather approving manner. I rather like exotics. Now, we'll move on. So now I want to talk about the trees. That's a little introduction to the woods themselves. Now the trees. This is an English oak in May. They flower in May. These are the catkins of the English oak. It was the case that Jeff Duckett showed a photograph showing you the difference between the 2 oaks, and I'm not going to repeat that. But they are very distinctive, and once you've learned it, it's fairly straightforward. But the English oak is the dominant oak tree of the fragments of woodland that I've been talking about. And it is different from the sessile oak. This is a sessile oak tree, and this was photographed in Bluebell wood, which is dominated by sessile oaks. The main distinction you can see in the winter months is that the upper branches go out at a sharp angle from the main tree. A very irritating thing, I don't suppose we can stop it, but coming down from the top is a thing which keeps saying, admit 1, see waiting, and lots of flashing lights keep coming on and off. So I'm having to ignore all of that, but I don't think I can get rid of it. Anyway, right at the top where the flashing lights are coming on is where the sessile oak breaks from the main stem. Sessile oaks have this feature of a much narrower branching system. Oak, of course, is well known for all natural history enthusiasts for the huge variety of wildlife that it supports. And this is chicken of the woods. This is one of my favorite fungi, one of the very few that I can remember the name of, and is indeed edible. It isn't chicken in the woods. You can eat the chickens if you like. And very nice they are too. That was photographed in Coldfall wood, but it's standing in there for a whole range of fungi that are associated not only with oaks, but also the other trees that we will be talking about. And these woods are full of wildlife, quite in addition to the plants that I'm obsessed by. Hornbeam, at last. I wanted to talk about hornbeam a little bit earlier, because it was the case that the gentleman who gave the talk about the bird AGM, whose name was Mark Malilu, a difficult one to pronounce, but he spoke quite a lot. His talk was about hawfinches and hornbeam. Well, he was talking about hawfinches and other birds. But he made the point, at which my ears pricked up. He made the point about the connection between hornbeam and hawfinches, and that hawfinches were particularly fond of hornbeams, and that they extracted the seeds, which are at the tip of hidden within these bracts. The hawfinches liked the bracts, and where you had large quantities of fruiting hornbeam, there was a good chance that you would have hawfinches. Hawfinches, of course, now very rare in London, although I'm told that they arrived, he told me, they arrived in some numbers in fairly recent years. And although I haven't personally seen hawfinches in these woods, there are records of hawfinch from Coldfall Wood, and indeed quite recently, I think 1995, hawfinches in Queenswood as well, and they were almost certainly feeding on the seeds of hornbeam. Yeah, very jagged saw-like edge they have. The other thing about hornbeam is it casts a very, very dense shade, and this is a coppiced hornbeam. Coppicing is when you cut back a tree down to the base and then allow it to grow back up again. And that was traditionally the way in which most of our woods were managed. Hornbeams were particularly valuable because they burn at a very, very high temperature. They form a very dense canopy in the summertime, and as a result of the dense canopy, very little is able to germinate on the woodland floor, which is a problem. Wild service, I'm going to run through these trees very quickly now because I don't want to lose time. This is the wild service tree, probably the best known of the indicator plants. We know from much research that there are particular plants associated with ancient woodland, and this is the tree that is most and best associated with ancient woods. It was also mentioned by Jeff Duckett in his talk, and he felt that if we spread the seeds around of wild service, this would help matters. I'm afraid I can't agree with him. The wild service tree is rare because it very seldom produces good fertile fruit, and the reason for that is that it evolved most of its life in the continent. It's a plant which likes very, very hot summers and very cold winters. Cold winters break the dormancy of the fruits. The hot summers allow the fruits to enlarge and become fertile. So it's not going to be much help unless you have fertile fruits. So a wild service tree in flower in May, wonderful indicator of ancient woods. You find this tree, it's going to be within an ancient wood, almost certainly. It produces these lovely sorbs, we would have to call them, later on in the year. It looks very much like a maple in terms of its leaf shape, which is very special. I'd love to take you out and show you in the woods themselves these things. I can't do it at the moment, very frustrating. Come next year when perhaps we'll be able to do it again. And not in the canopy, but further down within the woodland, in the sub-canopy, you have a whole range of other trees and shrubs. This particular one is the hawthorn, and this in fact is a hawthorn which I can tell because it has deeply cut leaves here, but it also has two stigmas within the flower. That tells me that it's neither of its parents, it's neither a common hawthorn or a midland hawthorn or woodland hawthorn. It is a hybrid hawthorn. And look, the caterpillar doesn't care, it's just good to eat. So there are a whole host of creatures that feed particularly on hawthorn. Now, one of the things I did was to cheer myself up before this talk, was to write the names down of all sorts of things which I always forget. And this is one of the caterpillars. It's the caterpillar of a moth, And so I wrote its name down, but of course I now can't find where I wrote it. So that's not much use to me. Perhaps it'll come to me later on. I'm not going to hang about because the talk is only just getting going. Hawthorns produce haws, Haws, hawthorns that are the food of many, many different species of bird. I'm not going to show you many, many different species of bird because I don't have many pictures of birds, but I will show you one bird, which I think, yes, this is my favorite bird. This is a song thrush. And it's sad that song thrushes are declining, which they are. I can remember a time when we used to hear song thrushes in my little London garden. Now you have to go into one of these little fragments of ancient woodland to hear song thrushes. But he's in there just to make the point that without the vegetation, without the berries, we'd have no song thrushes at all. So the vegetation is very important and birds depend upon it. Those are common trees, comparatively speaking. The wild service is something of a rarity, but I want to talk about two trees which we discovered in these woods, which have become very special. This is the flowers, the inflorescence of a pear tree. And pear trees are difficult botanically. There are two essential distinctions between the two different sort of pears that you get, and I couldn't work out which this one was because it grew in Queenswood, but it never flowered and it certainly never produced any fruits. So when we started coppicing, again we're going to have to get a move on, it was wonderful to find it flower and produce fruits. There's one of its fruits, that's known as an iron pear. It's hard, solid and inedible. That is one kind of pear which is extremely rare. Oliver Rackham, who you're going to meet in just a moment, said to me that of all the trees that he came across, he thought the wild pear was possibly the rarest. Quite distinctive from the cultivated pear, which escapes and suddenly turns up in woods. So that was lovely to find in Queenswood. And secondly, one of the few advantages of being the indoor meetings secretary was that I got to organize people to come and talk about plants. And I managed to get a Russian enthusiast for willows. And the day before she was to come and to do her talk, she was called Irina. I went down to the wood and I picked some leaves of this willow here. Not really expecting any great return, but I thought it'd be good to show it to her because I was puzzled by it. So I took these leaves along to Irina's workshop, Belayeva, the Russian lady, and she said, "Oh yes, they get it wrong. They get it wrong." She said, "They get it wrong." She had a lovely, lovely phrase, because it was thought to be a triple hybrid, a hugely complicated tree. It's not a triple hybrid, she said. It's a genuine native species. And she gave it its Latin name, which I will not conflict upon you. To me, it's Irina's a willow, very, very scarce. There it was in Coalfall Wood, and was just such a lovely tree to see. So there are advantages in having to organize indoor meetings from time to time. This very, very special. Good, I found it. Sawfly larva. I tried to do this talk with my wife the other day. I could not remember the name of this little caterpillar. Sawflies are quite widespread. This particular one will only feed on willows. That's why it's got into this talk. Willows have lots of dependents, and the sawfly larvae, you can tell a sawfly larva because it has more than 6 false legs around there. Caterpillars that are going to become moths have more than 6 legs. So this one's got about 8 different pairs of legs. That makes it a sawfly and not the larva of a butterfly or a moth. So the point being that I'm talking about plants, but there's all sorts of plants that you can have as well. Now on to habitat management. Because all these trees made these woods very, very dark, I realized at last what I needed to do was to start letting some light into the wood by coppicing. And that is what I set out to do. To do that, I read very widely around the subject. I went up and down to the Rystic Woods as well. And I corresponded with wait for it, Oliver Rackham, a wonderful, wonderful man. And Oliver Rackham was of tremendous help, as you might imagine. He told me quite a lot about some of the issues around coppicing. And I even wrote down, and I've now lost the piece of paper. Oh, it is so stressful, this talk. I've lost a piece of paper that tells me which woodland he went to. Somewhere on this piece of paper, there's the name of the wood that he went to, and I've forgotten it. Here we go. No, it just says Jordan. It just says Oliver Rackham. Anyway, he visited this very large, important wood in South Essex that I know like the back of my hand, but I can't remember its name. And that's his book, The Last Forest. It'll come to me in due course. It's because I'm worried about time. His best known plant, of course, is the best known woodland. Was the woodland he managed in Cambridgeshire, Hayley Wood, and it's in here just to explain about coppicing. These are he uses he's got here some wiring here, which is basically to keep the deer out. And these are young shoots from hazel. And it was coppiced last, you won't see this little note, which is 1979 to 80. Last coppiced in 1980. This photograph was taken in 1990. So this is a 10 years growth of coppice from the base here. So yeah, regrowing hazel coppice, and this is Tim Rich, who is the leading authority on crucifers. So I used all of that experience to start coppicing in Haringey. This is Coldfall Wood, and this is the result of coppicing in 1990. Mike Hammerson, some of you may know, was there at the time. That picture was taken. If I go back, that picture was taken. Yeah, that was taken in 1990, and then if I move on to the picture that you've just seen. There it goes. That was 93. That was 2 years later, just to make the contrast between the bare nature of the first photograph and the results of coppice, what happens when you coppice. That wonderful upsurging of vegetation. And what we're looking at there is rosebay willow herb. So I started coppicing in 1990. This was in the same wood, in Coldfall Wood, in 92. And these are the BTCV, and these are all hornbeams which are coming down. I'm going to go very fast now. And that is what we're aiming for. This, incidentally, is my son Ben. This is my wife Barbara. It's really nice to get the family involved. This is the dead hedge that we built around the coppice in Coldfall Wood. At the same 92, a couple of years later, I cut a rather similar coppice in Queenswood. In those days, this little, what we called the bottle tree, was alive and kicking. And again, you can see the dead hedge all around there. The idea of the dead hedge is to keep trampling out, essentially. The only oak tree I ever cut down, and it was a scary event, was this tree in Queenswood. There are too many oak trees in the sense of how the wood used to be historically. We had far fewer oak trees, and they took all the light away. So to let the light in, you need not only to coppice the hornbeam, you also needed to coppice some of the oak trees. That is what that was about. We used this horse to take the wood away that the BTCV had collected together. And I wrote down the name of the horse, and now I've lost a piece of paper that tells me. Don't worry about it. There we go. A before and after picture to show the advantages of coppicing if you're into increasing the flora. This is this is Coldfall Wood, where we came in for some major money from the Heritage Lottery Fund. A lot of money enabled us to do a major coppice all the way through the wood. This is the photograph taken in, it would have been about it was about 2006 this photograph was taken. 2 years later, I want you to notice this birch tree here. 2 years later, there's that same birch tree. Look at the way the vegetation has changed. An enormous arising of different plants into that area, which is what it was all about. This is a similar coppice we made in Queenswood 2 years later. So 2000 and about 2009, 2010, again a before and after picture. This was taken just after the coppice had been cut, as you can see. Later that year, this was taken in September of that same year. It demonstrates how the vegetation, and you can see what joy this was to a botanist. All these plants, all of them different, all of them there for good reasons, fascinating and wonderful, and supporting all kinds of wildlife. Before I say a little bit about some of that wildlife, quickly make the point that these woods have survived because we do not have deer. Many people who try and coppice in woods in southern England have problems because of deer like this muntjac, which feed on the regrowing trees that have been coppiced. So very quickly, a quick look through the plants that you get. It's roseberry willow herb, comes in very early, blown in from the outside. Now it has one wonderful associate, which is the elephant hawk moth. Here's the caterpillar of an elephant hawk moth. All the hawk moths have this little hook at the base. And so roseberry willow herb, very lovely if you're a caterpillar of a hawk moth, but also beautiful in the garden. Wood anemones are characteristic of ancient woodlands, indicator species. Two pictures before, that was just after the coppice have been cut. Wood anemones, what happens a year after you cut, see the way in which the numbers of flowers flourish through that process. The early dog violet is a characteristic plant of ancient woodland, and so is the common dog violet, and they are both essential if you happen to be a silver wash fritillary. There it is on the creeping thistle here. This is a male silver wash fritillary, such a beautiful, and we've had silver wash fritillaries in Coldfall Wood 2 years ago, which is such a joy. I'd love to find the caterpillars, but that we haven't managed to do, but they must be there somewhere or close by. Yellow pimpernel, another plant which is associated with old woods, and it survives in the seed bank as a buried seed. And it's by cutting the coppice and opening it up that allows the seeds to germinate and grow. Here is another plant, ragged robin, where the same thing applies. It grows back up. And perhaps the best known of all these coppice specialists is the digitalis, the foxglove, which can go for over 100 years in the seed bank as a buried seed, waiting for the moment when enough light comes through for the flora to function. You can see I'm going at speed. The slender St. John's wort, quite new to Haringey, turned up in both coppices, both Queenswood and Coldfall Wood. Fantastic plant to see. And this one, and this is also a relative of the plant we've just seen, and its name has hopped out. When you get old, the words disappear. Very sad, really. Anyway, it's used for treating depression, among many other things. And it's an ancient woodland plant, again, survives in the seed bank, together with these lovely plants. Now it's going ahead, I don't know why. okay, this is the only orchid that we've had in the wood, broad-leaved helleborine, and Goldilocks buttercup. These are all plants that are associated with old woods, and it's the coppicing that's brought all these plants back again. And cow wheat. This is an annual plant, unlike the other things we've looked at. It doesn't survive in the seed bank. It has to produce seed every year. Wonderful plant to see, and it's in Coldfort and Queens. I knew I wouldn't have time properly for this. This is to demonstrate, and I'll just do the demonstrating. One of my specialist interests is in exotic plants, plants that have escaped from gardens. And a lot of people have real problems with introduced plants. So I wanted to do some survey work. And when I did my survey back in 2007, I looked at the numbers of different plants, whether they were exotics or aliens, as they rudely call them, whether they were natives or aliens. So the first figure is an alien, the second figure is a native. So the ones around the edge, the dark green ones, they have a lot of alien plants, exotic showing, the ones in the middle very few. The point being that very few plants, alien plants, actually get very far into woods and stay there. Cherry laurel, quickly through them. Buddleia, of course, everybody knows. The Himalayan honeysuckle. The Himalayan honeysuckle does hang around for as long as 10 years in the wood. But should we worry about these things? No, we shouldn't. I get very cross when people get so upset about alien plants. On the whole, there are exceptions, but on the whole, they don't, in ancient woodland, cause a problem. This is one called the late Cotoneaster, because it flowers rather late. This is one called Monkey Puzzle. That was an extraordinary thing to find. I'm glad I just had time to show it to you. The yellow-flowered strawberry, which many people get upset about because it competes sometimes with the native. This is the native strawberry. Here they are two together competing. That's the yellow-flowered strawberry. That's the native strawberry. But actually, they get on perfectly well together. It's just exhibiting the place that they are. They're surrounded by houses. Plants move around. And this one, this lovely one, whose name I always forget, I've got the wrong nasty thing. It's a variegated form of I knew I'd forget the names of these things. Variegated yellow archangel, thank you. And finally, yellow form of stinking iris. Most beautiful plant, but the ones that turn up in Haringey are all yellow flowered forms of. In other words, they're garden cultivars, and so is this one. Water avens, extremely rare plant in southern England, virtually disappeared. Couldn't believe it when water avens turned up in the coppice in Coldfort, but it did. But it did it because it had escaped from somebody's garden, and it was simply a form known as Geomraveli Leonard's variety. Mark told me about this. Mark Spencer mentioned it to me. And finally, my last blessed plant, which I haven't written down, the dragon arum, which comes from the Mediterranean. And I welcomed it. I thought it was wonderful. It arrived vegetatively, and I waited 10 years before it produced a flower. So that's going to be our last picture. Thank you all. I'm afraid I had to rush at a great speed. I wanted to show you as many things as I could in the time I was allotted. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was a really fantastic talk, and well done for getting to grips with the technology and showing us just this amazing range of the flora that you've explored. It's lovely for you to talk us through those woods that you know so well and you clearly care very passionately about, and you know an awful lot about. So thank you ever so much for that. It was a really fantastic talk. We're very short of time for questions, but one thing that I did see coming through the chat was people reminiscing. So you've got people who remember that course, for, 40 years ago, somebody called Howard who attended the course, and people who are talking about their own memories of the woodland and of Birkbeck. So you've really triggered a lot of memories for people that I think are very special for them as well. I don't know if certainly I think we could have had probably another hour, to be honest, but it was really fascinating. You packed an awful lot into the talk. I don't know if it's possible to maybe just do one question anchor, and that's probably about all we've got time for.
Yeah, because what I've noticed is that people, they were kind of chatting, and there was, of course, about the wild service trees, but I think that was sort of answered throughout the text. But it was an interesting question, because I think some people, particularly beginners, people kind of just getting into woodlands, and particularly ancient woodlands. So Duncan Tate has asked, what defines an ancient woodlands as opposed to a secondary woodlands?
Oh, yeah, please, can I answer that? It was on my list. It was a thing I had to do in big letters. Tell them what an ancient woodland is. It's a wood that was present in the year 1600. Very precise. George Peterkin in the 1970s used the term ancient woodland. It was picked up by Rackham and many others since then. But that's what it is. And the reason for that is that there were very few woods planted before 1600, quite a few after 1600. So if you have a wood that was there 400 years ago, it's likely to have been there for a very long, much further time. Does that help?
Yeah, that's fantastic. And a lot of people are also sort of saying that you've been one of the main people who's inspired their interest in natural history. So you've made a great deal of difference to many, many people over the years, David, and people kind of, people treasure that very much. Please, I'm impressed with how much you remember and know about those woods. So please don't worry about, occasionally things go out of my head, and I'm not, I've not kind of got to your age. So you did a fantastic job. So, thank you ever so much. A couple of people have made comments. The moth was a lackey moth, by the way.
Yes.
And other people have kind of filled in the gaps. So that's been great. That is all we've got time for this evening. But thank you once again to David for really providing such a wonderful talk for us, and a really nice way of sort of rounding off his time as chair. We do have another talk coming up. It's in a couple of weeks' time, and that's going to be Jeff Ollerton talking about pollinators and pollination.